The galaxy's deadliest assassin moved through the starport like a shadow, invisible to everyone, yet keenly aware of every passerby. They'd accepted the mission without question, just another name, another target. They'd taken hundreds of lives from countless species across galaxies, nobles, criminals, generals, rebels, without remorse or hesitation. So, when their latest contract led them to the relatively obscure planet known as Earth, they'd hardly blinked. But the details of the assignment were odd enough to spark a flicker of curiosity. The target? A human. A species known for its chaotic nature and emotional volatility, not military prowess or threat. And yet, the price offered was astronomical, far beyond what any mere human life should command. The assassin dismissed their intrigue, rationalizing it as a testament to their reputation. Their employers trusted that once a target was marked, the outcome was certain. They'd been sent to Earth with little more than a file, detailing basic information about this particular human. Unlike most contracts, this file lacked the usual wealth of specifics: no military ranks, no criminal affiliations. Just a simple descriptor, an asset of significant importance. This peculiar lack of detail was both frustrating and intriguing. It suggested either someone hidden and powerful, or someone so ordinary that they could evade detection by nature of blending in. As they skimmed the file in the silence of their quarters, the assassin found themselves wondering which it was. Either way, they assured themselves, it made little difference. The human wouldn't last long. Arriving on Earth, the assassin observed the human's every move, tracking them with clinical precision. The man, name withheld, was younger than expected, perhaps in his mid-30s. He moved through crowded streets and open markets with ease, blending seamlessly with the flow of the crowd. His appearance was unremarkable, his interactions ordinary. He greeted vendors, occasionally stopped to chat with a passerby, and smiled with ease. He appeared oblivious to the fact that his life was under threat. The assassin watched with a detached interest as he moved with surprising confidence, though he never betrayed a hint of alarm or awareness. It was curious, but no more than a minor puzzle piece to be sorted out before the kill. The assassin was patient, silently trailing him across the city. They catalogued his daily routines, marking the predictable patterns and potential vulnerabilities. He seemed particularly fond of a secluded cafe at the edge of the city. It was quaint, crowded enough to offer cover but small enough to avoid attention. The assassin observed him there for several hours, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. A part of them was almost disappointed. Despite the exorbitant fee, there was no indication this human was anything other than what he appeared: average. Ordinary. Certainly not someone to warrant an interstellar bounty. On the third day of surveillance, however, things began to change. During his usual route back from the cafe, the human turned off the beaten path, taking a route that wound through narrow alleys and hidden corners of the city. It was unexpected and, for the first time, the assassin felt a flicker of doubt. The human moved with calculated precision, pausing at corners and glancing back in a way that seemed intentional. Was he aware of their presence? Or was he just lost? The assassin's instincts told them to stay hidden, but curiosity got the better of them, and they edged closer, careful not to make a sound. As they turned a corner, they spotted him standing there, his back against the wall, hands resting casually in his pockets. The assassin froze, momentarily thrown off. His face was calm, unreadable, but his posture hinted at something else, something that didn't quite fit with his earlier carefree demeanor. He waited in silence, his eyes scanning the darkness around him, and the assassin watched, assessing him from the shadows. His gaze was steady, confident yet calm. It wasn't the look of someone ignorant to danger. It was the look of someone expecting it. Had he somehow become aware of their presence? Impossible. The assassin shifted slightly, preparing to draw closer when the human spoke. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were addressing an old friend rather than a stranger lurking in the shadows. "Are you planning to hide there all night?" The words sent a chill through the assassin. They were caught, or at least, he was acting as though he knew. Their training had been relentless, exhaustive. They were invisible when they chose to be. And yet this human had sensed their presence? Steeling themselves, they stepped into view, watching for any signs of fear or alarm, but he only tilted his head, appraising them with a faint hint of curiosity. His expression was maddeningly calm, almost amused. The assassin didn't respond, silently sizing him up, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a small smile, one that seemed both welcoming and knowing, as if he were the one in control. "I'm guessing you're not here for a friendly chat," he remarked. The assassin's mind raced, struggling to reconcile this composed demeanor with the target's seemingly mundane background. His file indicated no advanced training, no military background, nothing to suggest he would have any reason to expect a confrontation. Yet here he was, staring them down with a confidence that defied explanation. The assassins shifted their weight, preparing for any sudden movements. But he only continued to watch, his gaze steady, assessing. Finally, the assassin spoke, their voice cool and precise. "You seem remarkably calm for someone in your position." He shrugged, as if discussing the weather. "I've been around long enough to know when I'm being watched. It's a skill I picked up along the way." For the first time, the assassin felt a strange sense of unease. This man, this human, shouldn't be reacting this way. Most targets panicked, attempted to flee, or lashed out in desperation. They didn't stand calmly, almost bemused, acknowledging there would be assassin as if it were a routine occurrence. It was unsettling. The assassin narrowed their gaze, attempting to regain control of the situation. "You may have noticed me," they said, "but it won't make a difference. You are, after all, only human." The man raised an eyebrow, that same maddening smile lingering. "Only human?" he echoed, a hint of amusement in his tone. "You may be underestimating us." The assassin bristled, but forced themselves to remain composed. They had been in worse situations, dealt with harder targets, and emerged victorious. This would be no different. And yet, as they studied him, something about his demeanor left them feeling uncertain. This human, who had no apparent reason to be calm or self-assured, radiated an unshakable confidence that was unlike anything they'd encountered. It was as if he knew something they didn't. Without another word, the human turned, walking down the alley with a casual stride that defied logic. He paused briefly, glancing back with a hint of a smirk. "Good luck," he said, as though this were a game rather than a deadly pursuit. And then he disappeared around the corner, leaving the assassins standing alone, a strange mixture of frustration and intrigue brewing within them. As they watched him vanish into the night, a rare sense of doubt crept into the assassin's mind. This human was not what they had expected, and for the first time in their career, they found themselves unsure of what lay ahead. The hunt, it seemed, was only just beginning. The assassin followed the human, keeping a carefully measured distance, their mind racing with a blend of frustration and intrigue. He moved purposefully through the winding streets, never glancing back. His strides were steady, each step taken with a deliberate calm that betrayed no fear or urgency. Every instinct told the assassin that he should be a straightforward target, someone who would panic or attempt to hide. But instead, he moved with a quiet confidence that hinted at something more, something hidden. They trailed him through narrow alleyways and past bustling crowds, careful to remain unseen. Their training ensured silence, allowing them to melt into the shadows, observing without being observed. And yet, at certain moments, the human seemed to slow, as though aware of their presence, as if he could sense the intent in their gaze even without looking back. The assassin felt the slightest twinge of unease. This behavior wasn't typical of the targets they pursued, especially not of a species as comparatively young and inexperienced as humans. The man's file had given nothing away. It described him as an average citizen with no special skills, no military training, and no criminal record. On paper, he was just another human in a vast galaxy, notable only for his lack of notability. It was this ordinariness that should have made him an easy kill, a straightforward task that required nothing more than timing and precision. But now, watching him move, studying his unflinching composure, the assassin realized they might have underestimated him. Finally, he stopped in front of a small, unassuming building tucked away on a quiet street. He turned, glancing around briefly before stepping inside, and the assassin moved swiftly to take up a position across the street. They observed, waiting for any sign of unusual activity, but the building remained silent, its windows dark and lifeless. They began to consider the possibility of entering, but something held them back, a strange instinct warning them to wait. So they stood in the shadows, silent, eyes trained on the door, feeling the unusual pressure of patience they were unaccustomed to. Minutes ticked by, and then, just as they began to doubt their instincts, the door creaked open, and the human stepped out. But this time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, a woman, her expression calm, almost serene. She whispered something to him, and he nodded, casting a glance in the assassin's direction that left no doubt in their mind. He knew they were there. Their target and the woman moved away together, and the assassin fell into step behind them, curiosity now mingling with their professional focus. The presence of this woman was unexpected. Nothing in the file had indicated any close relationships, no known associates, who would act as accomplices. Who was she? And more troublingly, how had they both detected the assassin's presence? The pair led the assassin deeper into the city, eventually arriving at a park on the outskirts, far from the crowded streets and curious eyes. The area was quiet, the late-night sounds of distant traffic and rustling leaves filling the air. They stopped by a bench, exchanging words that the assassin couldn't hear, and then the man turned, facing the direction of the assassin's hiding place with an unbroken stare. The woman beside him remained silent, her posture relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, as though assessing an unseen threat. There was no mistaking it, the man was looking directly at them, waiting. It was an invitation, as bold as it was unexpected. The assassin's instinct was to stay hidden, to observe, to gather more information before making a move. But the intensity of his gaze, the quiet challenge in his expression, pulled them forward, compelling them to abandon the shadows. They stepped into the light, moving toward the pair, concealing their surprise behind a mask of professionalism. When the assassin stopped a few paces away, the man spoke first, his voice carrying a calm authority that sent a chill down their spine. "You've been following me," he said. It wasn't a question. They didn't respond, waiting for him to reveal more, but he only regarded them with that same infuriating composure. Finally, the assassin broke the silence, their voice low and measured. "You're aware that I've been sent to eliminate you?" The man exchanged a glance with the woman, who gave a faint smile, and then he nodded, as if the idea was not only acceptable but expected. "I know," he replied simply. "And I imagine you're wondering why." The assassin didn't answer, their patience wearing thin. This was a mission, not a conversation, and yet the man seemed determined to prolong it, as though he had something to prove. But the woman's gaze held a calm, almost knowing look, as though she could see through their hardened exterior, straight to the curiosity they tried so hard to suppress. "It's rare for someone in your profession to experience doubt," the woman said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You're used to certainty, to precision, to knowing exactly what needs to be done and why. But with him, there's something different, isn't there?" The assassin stiffened, unwilling to admit the truth. They were, indeed, accustomed to a life of absolute clarity, to an unwavering sense of purpose. Their reputation had been built on it. But here, standing before this human and his strange companion, they felt the edges of that certainty begin to blur. "I don't need to understand why," the assassin said, their tone harsh. "I only need to fulfill the contract." The man smiled, a slight, almost sympathetic expression that made the assassin's blood run cold. "And that's what makes you so efficient," he said quietly. "But I wonder, have you ever considered the purpose behind your efficiency? The reason you carry out these orders without question?" The assassin's gaze hardened, but his words struck something deep within them, an uncomfortable truth they rarely allowed themselves to acknowledge. They had dedicated their life to perfecting their craft, to mastering the art of death, yet they had never questioned the motives of those who hired them. It was a thought they had long buried, dismissed as irrelevant. But now, with this human standing before them, that question resurfaced, insistent and unavoidable. What are you trying to say? They demanded, their voice laced with frustration. The woman spoke again, her tone gentle yet firm. Perhaps it's time to question the nature of your orders, she said, her gaze unwavering. Perhaps there's more at stake than a simple contract. The assassin clenched their fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. They had no use for cryptic words or philosophical musings. This was a mission, a job, nothing more. And yet, despite their training, despite the years of conditioning, they found themselves hesitating, the certainty they had relied on slipping away. The man stepped closer, his eyes filled with an intensity that defied explanation. There's a reason they've sent you to eliminate me, he said. And it has nothing to do with my worth. It has everything to do with what I represent. The assassin felt a chill run through them. They had encountered hundreds of targets over the years, but none had spoken to them like this. None had dared to challenge their purpose, to question the motives behind their existence. And for the first time, they found themselves unable to look away, unable to dismiss the words that echoed in their mind. What do you represent? They asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The man held their gaze, his expression filled with a quiet strength that was almost terrifying in its intensity. A choice, he replied. The choice to decide what your purpose truly is. To break free from the constraints placed upon you. To understand that you are more than a weapon. The words hit the assassin like a physical blow, shattering the carefully constructed walls they had built around themselves. For years they had defined themselves by their role, by the orders they followed without question. But now, standing before this human and his companion, they felt a flicker of something new, something they had never allowed themselves to feel: doubt. The assassin took a step back, trying to steady themselves, feeling the foundation of their identity shaken by the words they'd just heard. They'd operated with a single-minded focus, trained to believe that questioning their purpose was a weakness, a dangerous liability that could lead to hesitation in critical moments. But now, with this human calmly standing before them, they felt their training, the very essence of who they thought they were, beginning to unravel. The man, sensing the turmoil beneath the assassin's steely exterior, spoke again, his tone softer but no less intense. You've spent years following orders, haven't you? Years of executing tasks with precision, never once looking beyond the target in front of you. He paused, letting his words settle. But have you ever wondered who benefits from your obedience? Who truly gains from the lives you take? The assassin's eyes narrowed, instinctively recoiling from the implication that their role was a tool in someone else's agenda. They had always told themselves they worked independently, choosing contracts based on skill and professionalism. But the man's questions planted a seed of doubt that was beginning to grow, roots burrowing into the cracks in their carefully maintained resolve. I don't care about the motives of those who hire me, the assassin replied, their voice steady but with an edge of defensiveness. I've built a life free of attachments, free of politics. I serve only the highest bidder. The woman spoke now, her voice calm but piercing, as though she could see the turmoil raging inside them. You may tell yourself that, but every action, every choice, ultimately serves a purpose. Whether you acknowledge it or not, your actions have consequences that ripple beyond your immediate target. The assassin clenched their jaw, unwilling to give in to this unsettling feeling that their life, one they had always regarded with pride and detachment, could be nothing more than a series of manipulated choices. They had been efficient, controlled, methodical. The idea that someone else could be dictating the direction of their life undermined everything they had worked for. And yet, there was something undeniable in the man's words. The assassin thought back to the people they had encountered, the contracts they'd accepted. Faceless clients, unknown motives. Each mission had been executed without question, without the need to understand the broader implications. They had always dismissed such questions as irrelevant, distractions that could cloud their focus. But now, standing here, those forgotten faces, once thought meaningless, began to resurface in their mind, each one weighted with new significance. The man's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of compassion in his gaze. You don't have to be a pawn, he said quietly. You have the power to choose a path beyond mere obedience, beyond the dictates of unseen hands. You can find a purpose that belongs solely to you. The assassin's heart raced, their mind struggling to process the weight of his words. They had built a life of calculated control, each step meticulously planned to avoid vulnerability, to shield themselves from anything that could compromise their effectiveness. Yet here they were, grappling with a possibility they had never allowed themselves to consider. You think I can just walk away from this? They asked, their voice laced with a mixture of skepticism and longing. You think I can abandon everything I've become? The woman stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. What have you become? She asked, her voice gentle but unyielding. A weapon? A shadow with no voice, no will of its own? Or are you something more, someone capable of creating their own path, of living with purpose beyond survival and obligation? The assassin felt a pang of vulnerability they hadn't felt in years, a deep-seated longing that was foreign and frightening. They had always known fear in a clinical sense, the type that sharpened reflexes and heightened instincts. But this was different. This was a fear of being truly seen, of confronting a life that might hold more meaning than they had ever allowed themselves to consider. For the first time, the assassin allowed themselves a brief glimpse into a life beyond their profession. A life where they weren't merely a tool but a being with agency, capable of defining their own purpose. The thought was intoxicating, and yet terrifying. It threatened to dismantle the very identity they had constructed to survive. I don't even know what that kind of life would look like, they admitted, their voice barely audible, the words escaping before they could contain them. The admission left them feeling exposed, raw in a way they had never experienced. The man nodded, as if he understood. No one can define it for you, he said. It's something you'll have to discover for yourself, step by step. But know this, you're not alone. The universe is full of beings, human and otherwise, who have faced similar choices, who have walked away from the roles forced upon them to forge something new, something real. A strange silence fell between them, as though the weight of possibility hung in the air, pressing down on them all. The assassin found themselves looking at the man with something resembling admiration, a feeling that was entirely foreign in their line of work. This man, a supposed target, had exposed a hidden truth that had lain dormant within them for years, and in doing so, had given them something they had never known they were missing, the option to choose. The woman watched them both, her expression soft but resolute. It's a dangerous path, she said quietly. But it's one worth walking. To live by your own terms, to fight not for the highest bidder, but for what you believe in, that's where true strength lies. The assassin let her words sink in, feeling the edges of a decision forming within them, one that defied everything they had known. It felt impossible, absurd even, to consider abandoning a life of absolute precision, of flawless obedience. But as they looked into the eyes of the human who had unwittingly become their mentor, they knew that this choice, terrifying as it was one they could no longer ignore. In that moment, they made a silent promise to themselves. They would finish this contract, fulfill the terms that had bound them to this mission. But after that, once this task was complete, they would begin a new journey, one that would lead them toward the answers they had spent so long avoiding. The assassin looked back at the man, their gaze now filled with a determination that bordered on defiance. I don't know what lies ahead, they said, their voice steady but tinged with an unfamiliar vulnerability. But I'll find out. I'll find my purpose, on my own terms. The man nodded, a faint smile touching his lips, and for a brief moment, the assassin saw a glimpse of something they had never known, a connection, an unspoken understanding between two beings who had chosen to define their own paths, no matter the cost. With that, the assassin turned away, disappearing back into the shadows. But this time, as they walked away, they felt the first stirrings of freedom, a spark of hope ignited within them, one that no contract, no client, could ever extinguish. The assassin spent the following days torn between an impulse to complete the contract and an inner struggle that gnawed at them relentlessly. Their instructions were clear, their path meticulously outlined, yet the simplicity of it all felt hollow, insufficient to mask the chaos within. They had been crafted into a weapon of unparalleled precision, conditioned to execute commands without sentiment or hesitation. However, now, With their target's words echoing in their mind, the previously sharp outlines of their purpose had begun to blur. The alien assassin's society was governed by an unbreakable hierarchy, one that valued order above all else. In this system, to question one's role or to disobey was met with severe consequence, often exile or worse. Loyalty and discipline were virtues ingrained into every individual from an early age, and defiance was nearly unheard of. But as they navigated these conflicting feelings, the assassin found themselves caught between the instincts of duty and a strange desire to understand. As they prepared for what they assumed would be the final confrontation with the human, they meticulously went over every detail of the mission in an effort to clear their mind of distractions. Their weapons were ready, and their mental focus was sharp, at least that was what they told themselves. But no amount of preparation could quiet the questions that had taken root. For the first time in their existence, they felt the weight of uncertainty, a sensation that was both foreign and unsettling. The man's words had stirred something dormant within them, a quiet realization that they were more than a set of skills and protocols. The notion that they could forge their own path, separate from the expectations of their society, clung to them like an unwelcome specter. This small but insistent thought was both a seed of hope and a shadow of fear, reminding them that their carefully constructed identity might be nothing more than a facade. On the day of their planned final encounter with the human, they waited in a concealed position, watching as he moved about his routine, seemingly oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. Each time the human smiled or spoke, the assassin felt an odd pang, one that they were reluctant to name. For all the years of training, they had been taught that emotions were weaknesses, flaws that compromised one's effectiveness. But now, as they observed this man who had so calmly unraveled their defenses, they felt a strange kinship, a faint spark of respect, even admiration. At the scheduled time, they emerged from the shadows, revealing themselves to the human in a deliberate display of presence. The human didn't appear surprised. In fact, he looked almost expectant, as though he had anticipated this encounter. His expression was calm, his gaze unwavering as he faced the assassin. The human spoke first, his tone gentle but firm. "You're here to finish what you started, aren't you?" he asked, though there was no accusation in his voice, only a quiet understanding. The assassin remained silent, wrestling with the inner turmoil that had only intensified in the face of his calmness. They were poised, weapon ready, yet something held them back, an invisible barrier that refused to let them proceed. The human took a step closer, and the assassin's grip tightened reflexively, though they made no move to attack. "Before you do anything," the man continued, "ask yourself this: who will benefit from my death? And who will lose something far more valuable?" The assassin's mind reeled, caught off guard by the simplicity and depth of his question. It was as if the man could see through them, past the layers of training and conditioning, straight to the conflict that lay buried beneath. They had never allowed themselves to consider the implications of their actions, never wondered about the lives disrupted or the people affected. Each target was a name, a face, and a mission to complete. But now, as they looked at this human who had chosen words over violence, the implications of their choices weighed heavily on them. "I don't know," the assassin replied, the admission feeling like a betrayal to their training, but also a moment of clarity. "I was never meant to ask questions. I was only meant to follow orders." The human nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Orders only take you so far," he said. "Eventually, you have to decide for yourself. It's a terrifying freedom, but one that defines who you truly are." The assassin felt a shiver pass through them, a sense of possibility they had never dared to entertain. For so long, they had viewed their existence as a series of obligations, bound by loyalty to a code they had never questioned. But here, faced with a man who embodied the very notion of choice, they found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew. "Why would you give me this choice?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. "You know what I am, what I've done." The human's eyes softened, and his gaze held no judgment, only compassion. "Because everyone deserves a chance to find their own path, even those trained to think they're beyond redemption. You're not just a weapon, you're someone capable of change." The assassin's heart pounded as the weight of his words sank in. They had spent a lifetime honing their skills, perfecting the art of detachment, yet in this single moment, they felt exposed, vulnerable in a way they had never known. "Maybe you're right," the assassin said slowly, each word laced with uncertainty and a hint of newfound resolve. "But if I walk away from this, if I reject what I was created to be, who am I?" The human's gaze never wavered as he replied, "That's the journey. Finding out who you are, beyond the labels, beyond the expectations others have placed upon you. It's a path only you can walk, and only you can define." The assassin stood in silence, the gravity of his words settling over them. They realized then that this encounter had changed them irrevocably, that the decision they faced was not just about sparing a life, but about reclaiming their own. "I don't know if I'm ready," they admitted, their voice wavering with the weight of uncertainty. "No one ever is," the human replied gently. "But the choice is yours. And that's where true strength lies, not in blind obedience, but in the courage to define yourself." The assassin took a deep breath, feeling the chains of their past beginning to loosen, the rigid structure of their identity starting to crack. The journey ahead was daunting, filled with unknowns and potential dangers, but for the first time, they felt a sliver of hope, a sense of possibility they had never thought was within reach. They looked at the human, a silent understanding passing between them. Without another word, the assassin turned away, disappearing back into the shadows. But this time, their steps felt lighter, as though a burden they had carried for so long had finally been lifted. They didn't know what awaited them, nor did they know who they would become. But as they walked away from the man they had once seen as nothing more than a target, they knew one thing for certain: their path, from this moment onward, would be one they chose for themselves. And for the first time, that thought brought them a sense of peace they had never known. The assassin walked away from the encounter, feeling a strange mixture of relief and tension. The decision they had made to leave the human alive weighed heavily on them, yet it also felt as if a massive weight had been lifted. Their life up to this point had been one of structured precision, clear goals, and an unquestioning adherence to the mission. But now, for the first time, they felt the pangs of uncertainty ripple through them like a distant, unsettling echo. Their homeworld had never fostered this kind of introspection. In their society, each individual's path was predetermined, shaped by a rigid hierarchy that left no room for personal variance. And while the assassin had always thought they were content, this recent mission had pulled back the veil on a life they had never realized was shrouded in a self-imposed blindness. The idea of questioning purpose, of examining one's life for meaning beyond directives, had been dismissed in their society as a wasteful indulgence. But now, having spared the life of a human who had given them this very challenge, they felt a sense of rebellion that was exhilarating and terrifying. They returned to their hidden sanctuary, a place designed for rest between assignments but nothing more, a sterile environment devoid of personal touches or sentimental objects. This space, which had once felt like a place of security, now seemed like a cold prison. Every item, every inch of the room, symbolized obedience, adherence to the role assigned to them without question. But now, this room, these tools, felt hollow, like echoes of a life that had been imposed upon them. Sitting down in the small, functional chair at the center of the room, they allowed themselves, for the first time, to reflect on what they truly desired. What did it mean to live without orders, without someone else's mission shaping their every step? The human's words echoed within them, stirring thoughts that were still fragile, unformed, yet powerful. To live on their own terms felt like an impossible dream, one as distant and unreachable as the galaxies they had crossed in pursuit of their targets. Yet the human had made it seem attainable, even necessary. Days passed as they weighed the consequences of their choice. News of their failure to complete the mission was certain to reach their superiors soon, and retribution was inevitable. Their society did not tolerate mistakes or dissent. But each day, the assassin felt more resolute. Their decision had already altered them beyond return. There was no going back to the life they had led before. That life was over, and the assassin knew it. Finally, the summons came. A cold and personal message arrived, instructing them to return to their home planet for evaluation. They knew this meant judgment, interrogation, and likely punishment. But instead of dread, they felt a strange calm. The choice they had made was theirs, and that thought alone filled them with a resilience they hadn't known existed within them. The journey home felt surreal, like returning to a place that no longer held any meaning. Each step through the vast halls of their society's command center felt heavier, as if with every movement they were shedding pieces of the identity that had been forged for them. They were greeted by a tribunal of high-ranking officials, beings they had once revered as the ultimate authority, but who now seemed as lifeless as the protocols they represented. The tribunal members watched them with unreadable expressions, their eyes cold and analytical. They asked question after question, probing for the reasons behind their failure. The assassin answered honestly, speaking of the choice they had made, the value they saw in the human, and the decision to spare a life that had sparked something new within them. They spoke of the yearning to define their own path, to live outside the constraints imposed upon them since birth. The tribunal's reaction was one of silent disapproval, their faces frozen in unreadable masks. They listened, but the assassin could sense the lack of empathy, the rigid adherence to the laws of their society that allowed no room for deviation. The tribunal members finally declared their judgment: exile. They would be stripped of their rank, their resources, and their name, and cast out from society, condemned to roam the stars as an outcast. For a moment, a pang of fear gripped the assassin, but it quickly gave way to an unexpected feeling of liberation. Exile meant freedom from the shackles of their former life. Exile meant the opportunity to explore their own path, unbound by the constraints that had once defined them. Without a word, they left the tribunal hall, walking past the familiar faces of former comrades and subordinates. No one acknowledged them. Their presence was now an affront to everything their society valued. But as they stepped out into the vastness of the universe, they felt an overwhelming sense of possibility. The future lay before them, uncharted and uncertain, but it was their own. In the solitude of their ship, the assassin thought once more of the human who had set this change into motion. They thought of his words, his courage, and the way he had challenged them to see beyond their own limitations. They realized that the human strength wasn't just in his resilience, but in his ability to inspire others to question, to grow, and to break free. As they charted a new course, away from the home they could no longer return to, the assassin embraced this new beginning. The universe was vast, filled with countless stars and worlds yet to be discovered. And for the first time, they would experience it not as an instrument of destruction but as a free being, guided by choices they would make for themselves. They had no clear destination, no orders, and no obligations, only the vast expanse of space and the knowledge that their path was now truly their own. And in that freedom, they found the kind of peace they had never known. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with hope, a hope they had not allowed themselves to feel until now.